Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Making the Argument. We have a very interesting episode this time with a very important guest because, look, I can't tell you how many times serving in the Virginia legislature, I have gone back home or I have gone on social media or someone and I've said, do you realize that the other side or the government or when it is trying to do X? And what I constantly get is, that's ridiculous. Nobody was trying to do that. Nobody wants that to happen. And then you'll present evidence and you'll say, okay, but here was the vote, or here was the bill, or here's what this actually means. And they'll say, that's not true. You've got to be misrepresenting it. And I'll be like, no, here's the language for the bill. You can actually read it yourself. And I will still get pushback as if I'm being divisive. Like, it's not that the bill's divisive. It's not that the fact, no. It's that me bringing it up, me drawing attention to it is divisive. And the point I want to make out here very calmly, coolly, and collectively is the people telling you about something that is actually happening, that have all of the receipts for it, they're not the ones causing the division, right? Pointing out something that is actually taking place is not in and of itself the divisive thing. In fact, if you're someone that looks at that and automatically thinks to yourself, they're being divisive, when really what they're just giving you is facts and perspective on it, maybe you should use that as an indication to yourself that, oh, if I automatically assume that this is being divisive, but it's actually happening, maybe there's an actual problem here that needs to be addressed. Now, my guest today, Jeff Younger, has been involved in a very long custody battle with respect to one of his fraternal twins being diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Now, the marriage dissolved. It was annulled. And now the mother, again, this was a child that I said something about wanting to be a girl at age 3, was diagnosed with gender dysphoria at age 5. And now the mother wants to completely reinforce this, right? We call it gender affirming care. I think it's probably more accurately described as dysphoria affirming care, but gender affirming care has become the popular, the politically correct way to address this. And the father, Jeff, had obvious concerns with this, especially when you look at some of the things that can potentially happen, some of the chemical treatments that take place, the potentially surgical treatments that could take place. But here's the crazy part. If we were just talking about California right now, you'd be like, oh yeah, this is probably a real problem, right? You probably got the state that's automatically lining up behind the mother and obviously pushing gender affirming care, all of these things. This all started in Texas. Texas is where a lot of these problems have actually begun. Texas judges were handing down rulings that I don't feel were properly recognizing the very legitimate psychological and medical concerns that a father has for his son. So, Jeff, thank you very much for being willing to come on and share about what is going on with this particular case. Can you give us, I tried to give just a brief summary there, but can you give us maybe a 5-minute once over the world, what's going on?
Yeah, it all started when my son was 2. My ex-wife, who is a pediatrician, began to transition my son to a girl right while I was living there and we were still married. She began to I first noticed it when she would put him into timeouts and she would say, don't be a boy, the monsters only eat boys, and then leave him alone in a room, things like this. And when I said she couldn't do this anymore, she used her relationships with licensed care providers to force me out of the house. She filed for divorce. At 3 years old, my son told me that his mother says that he's a girl and that I'm wrong, that he's a boy. If you go onto YouTube, you can search for "Mommy Says I'm a Girl." It's probably got 1 billion views out there that went worldwide. I'm an Orthodox Christian. It even went all over Eastern Europe. They couldn't believe it. And it's the first iPhone video I ever took. And it's my son just past his 3rd birthday telling me that mommy says he's a girl. This began to get ever worse. She began to socially transition him to a girl. She presented him to the world as a girl named Luna and put him into a dress. The Capel School District under Principal Mickelson helped to transition my son secretly behind my back. And we can talk about why that's legal in all the 50 states right now. I would bring my son to school in boys' clothes. The teacher would give him a dress and make him use the girls' restroom.
Wait a second, stop. The teacher would?
Yeah, oh, yes. Yeah, I didn't find out about this for over a year.
So wait, I mean,
Mhm.
let me just stop you real quick right there, because that's it is one thing. Like, look, the most complicated part of this is typically in a lot of these situations, you have parent against government or parent against school system
Right.
or parent against, now you have parent against parent. And you would think that the proper position for the school in something like this might be to be like, this is something for
Mhm.
them to work out. If the boy, I mean, I wouldn't blame a teacher for saying, if the kid shows up in a dress, it's not my position to change him. If the kid shows up in pants, it's not my position to change it.
Right.
You actually had a teacher physically taking your child and changing their clothes?
Yes. There was a dress they kept at the school, and he would change into that dress if I brought him in boys' clothes, which I always did. And the important thing to know here is right up until the time I lost my parental rights, 6 years later, um, my son never presented as a girl to me. He's always presented as a boy to me and a girl to his mother. And I asked him about it, and he just flat out told me, my mom doesn't love me if I'm not a girl. And that's why he would wear girls' clothes. So as this ramped up with the school issue and her presenting him to the world, as a girl, after our divorce, we had a second trial in 2019. I brought in the world's transgender experts to that trial in this little courtroom in Dallas County. She brought in the world's experts on her side. She didn't put a single one of her experts on the stand because we would have demolished them. During depositions, she had hired Johanna Olson Kennedy, who runs the largest gender clinic in America. I just asked her in the deposition, very simple question. What is the medical basis for removing healthy body parts from children? You're a doctor, you have to have a medical basis. And she said, if they cause psychological distress, they're not healthy body parts, and we remove them. So she didn't put any of her experts on the stand.
Wait,
I brought in
can I stop you right there real quick? So
Yeah.
let me get this straight. If somebody's right eye caused
Mhm.
them psychological distress,
Mhm.
her response, then her logic would be, then it is
Mhm.
perfectly okay to remove a healthy
Mhm.
eye.
Yes, and there is a psychological condition called body dysmorphia,
Yeah.
where these people go out of the country to have their body parts removed because it's actually illegal in the United States to do that. But they made a special exception for castrating kids.
Oh
The
my.
FDA made a special exception for it.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to
So
interrupt you. I just wanted to
no, it's all
clarify
right.
that. Yeah.
In 2019, I brought in Dr. Levine, who ran the first transgender clinic at Johns Hopkins University in the 1970s. And they shut their clinic down after 4 years because all their data showed that the treatments were harming patients. So we knew back in the 70s all of this stuff was bad and evil and didn't work. So I won the 2019 trial. I got 50-50 custody, no child support. And most importantly, I got a check on all of the medical rights. So she couldn't do anything to my son. During that period, I had spent several $100,000 of my own money and created an entire movement in Texas to pass a law in this state to outlaw these procedures. I successfully did that in 2020. They took out 3 sentences from that law that I wrote, which classified it as felony child sexual abuse. And that becomes important later. So what the Dallas County judges did is they said, well, we didn't get the verdict that we wanted from the Texas jury, and the judge didn't do what we wanted. So they transferred my case to the 301st District Court under Judge Mary Brown. I call her Bloody Mary Brown. Bloody Mary Brown, using temporary orders, systematically has stripped me of all my parental rights. I can't see my children. I can't write them letters. I don't know what school they go to. I haven't seen them in 3 years. I have no idea what's happened to them.
Okay, let me stop you right there real quick, because this is always the question, right? This is always the thing where it's like, okay, all this sounds really good, but you lost your parental rights, and surely a judge would not have done that without good cause. So knowing that anybody can go and look this up and look at the judge's opinion and whatnot, tell us what the justification was for you losing your parental rights.
The quote from the order stripping me of my parental rights said that I was unable or unwilling to follow the court's orders. So the question is, what were the court's orders? There were 2 of them. One of them was for supervised visitation. The judge chose forensic counseling services, which is based out of Dallas County. It was a gay and transgender therapist who would refuse to allow me to change my son into boys' clothes during the visits. Because I have always refused to affirm my son as a girl, I declined to go to the supervised visits. The second reason is I'm under an illegal and unconstitutional gag order. This interview is illegal in Texas and California. I'm not allowed to talk about any issue around transgenderism, gender expansiveness, or gender dysphoria. I have a lifetime ban from all interviews, writing newspaper articles, doing any podcasts, or writing any op-eds or articles. And I'm not even allowed to tell you whether my sons are boys or girls.
Wait a second.
So I have never.
How do
Yeah.
they? How in the? So they actually. She. Was this part of? Was this part of her taking away your custody rights? Was a corresponding gag order that says you can't talk about transgenderism?
They were trying to shut down my political advocacy to get that law passed in Texas. They didn't want me to go testify at the state legislature and to lobby in the state legislature to get that law passed. That's the real reason they put that gag order on me. And because I didn't go to supervised visitations, which would have forced me to affirm my son as a girl, and because I have consistently violated the gag order on principle, I've told the judge in court that I have contempt for the text of the order for violating my rights as a Texan. I have, because Texas has better free speech rights than even the federal government. Mm-hmm. So I have contempt as a Texan for the text of the order. I have contempt for her as a judge for issuing such an order against a citizen of the state of Texas. And so I'm in maximum contempt of court. And I told her she was obligated to give me, therefore, the maximum sentence for criminal contempt, which is 18 months in the Lou Sterrett jail in Dallas County. And she refused to send me to jail. And the reason was I had a writ of habeas corpus already prepared, and it would have been struck down in 4 days, and I'd have been out. And I could have sued the county and sue the county's insurance company for millions of dollars for violations of my rights. So instead, what they did is they said, well, you can't follow the court order. So because you can't follow the court order, you can't see your kids anymore. And they chose that route.
So this was 2021?
Yes.
Okay.
And then because I finally got that law passed and it went into effect in 2021, January 1st, 2021, my ex-wife petitioned the court to let her move the children to California so she could castrate my son. Judge Bloody Mary Brown in the 301st District Court of Dallas County allowed her to move to California to castrate my son. I took that up to the Texas Supreme Court, which is supposed to be a conservative court, and Justice Blacklock, I call him Black-Hearted Blacklock, and Justice Young wrote an opinion denying my petition, saying absurdly that my son was no more likely to be transitioned in California than he would be in Texas.
Oh, wait. Stop. Mm-hmm. How does anybody say that with a straight face when California has passed its own legislation, setting itself up as something of a sanctuary state for this sort of thing? Like,
it's a transgender kidnapping state. And that was the argument that I made to the Texas Supreme Court. I said, if the court finds that it's not in my son's interest to have these procedures done, California will not return my sons, even on a court order. And so this order by the district judge, Bloody Mary Brown, amounted to removing the protections of Texas law from a child in order to abuse them. And I have an opinion from Ken Paxton, who I consider the best attorney general in the history of the United States. He's won more federal cases against the federal government for states' rights than any attorney general in history. He's definitely the best one in Texas history. And Ken Paxton did a thorough analysis of this at federal law and Texas law. He went back into English common law and even into Spanish juridical law, because we trace our legal system through Spain. Though it doesn't matter where you go, it's always been illegal to castrate kids because the children have a fundamental liberty interest in procreation, and no parent can remove a fundamental liberty interest from a child permanently. It's why you can't tattoo your child, you can't give your kid drugs, and so forth. So even with all of that evidence, the Texas Supreme Court under Justice Black-Hearted Blacklock let my son be moved to California. I'm now going to trial on the 28th of this month. This is my last shot. If I lose this trial, my son will be castrated in November.
So real quick, how do you know that? Because from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong here, right? From what I understand, there are still orders in place which and now again, I understand that these sort of orders become really, really problematic when California doesn't recognize, the orders coming from Texas. but originally my understanding is that, again, both of you had say, so you both had to bless off on puberty blockers or any sort of surgery. And I think it's also important for people to understand, and I want clarification on this as well, because there's two ways that whole castration can take place. There's chemical, and then there's surgical.
Yes.
Is the concern right now that if you lose this case, that essentially, even if the Texas order still stands, there will be legally nothing you can do about it within the state of California, and your ex-wife has already demonstrated that she is going to go through with this?
No, my ex-wife has actually filed to remove the permanent injunction, which prevents us from doing these procedures. And she has specifically said that my son is now in Tanner stage 4 puberty, and it's emergency, that he must be chemically castrated as an emergency. So she's filed to remove the injunction. It's not that I'm concerned that California won't honor the injunction, which it can't under its laws. She's actually asking the court to remove the injunction. And that's what the trial on the 28th is actually about, whether the court will remove that injunction and allow my son to be castrated.
And that's a Texas court?
No, that's a California court. Remember, she moved to California. Yeah. Once you're in state for 6 months, you can move a case to that state, and that's what's happened. So we don't have to guess. The court filings, she specifically says, I need to remove this injunction to administer emergency puberty blockers to my son. Am I worried about chemical castration or physical castration? I'm worried about both. The medical records show that they intended to chemically castrate James when he was 8 here in Texas. That's what I fought here in Texas to stop. Sorry about that. That's what I fought here in Texas to stop. In California, the medical records at Kaiser Permanente show that they have an intention to immediately administer puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. That will stop his puberty and sterilize him within 2 weeks. His penis will never grow. He'll have a toddler's penis. He has had detailed discussions with doctors at Kaiser Permanente. It's all in the medical records, in which he talks about not wanting his penis anymore. His mother says that he frequently says that he doesn't want his penis, and that he knows that if they remove his penis, he says he can still pee because he'll still have a vagina. They have talked to my son about removing his testicles. They have literally talked to my son about what I'm about to tell you.
And how old is he right now?
They have told,
just to frame this?
He's 12.
He's 12. Okay.
They have told him that they can remove his testicles and then harvest the sperm in them, so that later he can have a baby as a woman.
Oh my gosh.
The doctors are telling him this, and he completely believes them. So there's no doubt in my mind that Kaiser Permanente doctors have already set up a pipeline of my son to be chemically castrated and physically castrated at 14 or 15. That's in the medical records.
That is absolutely obscene.
And that is what the Texas Supreme Court under Justice Blacklock allowed to happen. I told them specifically in my filings, this is exactly what's going to happen. I even named possible hospitals that it could happen at. Like, they knew, the judges knew that this was wrong and that it would hurt my kid, and they voted to let my kid go anyway.
What was the final vote out of the Texas Supreme Court?
There was only one justice, Justice Devine, who voted to protect my son. All the other justices voted with the Republican establishment to let my son go.
So let me ask you a question on this, because this is something that, and here's what I'm going to try to do. Because this isn't this is infuriating. But I will always try to make an attempt to at least understand. I understand how unreasonable people will cheer this. I understand how people have completely bought into this narrative that you can just arbitrarily depart from reality whenever you feel like it. And not only do you have an inherent right to, but then we're going to actually negate parental rights in order to reinforce it. And I understand how the medical industry has already figured out how to profit massively for the life of a patient or something. So if you're unreasonable, I'm not concerned about this. I'm trying to figure out how does what should be a seemingly reasonable person look at this and say, like, from a judicial stand, because I don't want judicial activists. Judges are supposed to faithfully interpret the law. I prefer a Scalia approach, an originalist approach. Is there any way a justice could have looked at this and said, I don't like this. This isn't right. I don't think this is what the law should be, but The law does allow this, and therefore, in good faith, as my role of a justice, I have to rule this way.
Mm-hmm.
Is there any way that could have happened in this situation?
In Texas, no. In California, yes. California has passed a sense of the legislature. It is which is binding policy on the state. A lot of people don't know what that means, but it means that it becomes a public policy of the state. And they've passed statutes which require courts to consider whether a parent is in favor or not of gender-affirming care in deciding what custody arrangements and visitation arrangements they should have. In Texas, no. One of the problems we have, well, there's a number of problems. I believe the judiciary under the U.S. Constitution is just mal-designed. I think if you read the Federalist Papers, they worried that the judiciary would be too weak relative to the other branches, and that's completely wrong. We've seen from the contact with reality. In family court, it's much worse. So in most states, I think in all states, temporary orders are not appealable from family court. So when they stripped me of my parental rights, I could not appeal that. I could go up on what's called a writ of mandamus, but those are discretionary, less than 3% are even heard. And they just really are loath to change decisions in family court anyway. The federal judiciary, even if your civil rights are violated in family courts, the federal judiciary has adopted a rule. It's not a statute. It's just a rule promulgated by the U.S. Supreme Court called the domestic relations exception. And that means that when your civil rights are violated or constitutional rights are violated in family court, federal courts will not hear them. The federal courts have just said, we're not going to uphold people's rights in family court disputes. So you really don't have anywhere to go out of family court. Second of all, the family law in all 50 states gives family court judges more leeway than any other judge. Mm-hmm. No judge has more leeway. I would argue that U.S. Supreme Court justices have less leeway than a district judge in family court.
Well, and it's also important to understand, mm-hmm. if I understand this correctly, in Texas, mm-hmm. your district and appellate court judges are elected, correct?
That is correct.
Okay, so
that is correct.
Okay.
Yep, and I could tell you about some election shenanigans with my judge because I almost got her out of office. Yeah. But the Republican Secretary of State invalidated 1/3 of the Republican votes in that election to get her back in office. Anyway, so the all 50 states, family court judges are empowered to rule, quote, in the best interests of the child. And that is in the law of all 50 states. Here's the question. What is the best interest of the child? Mm-hmm. Well, under federal law, under Troxel, the best interest of the child is whatever a fit parent decides it is, as long as it isn't abuse or neglect. So there's a wide range of things that could be in the best interest of the child, and it is to be decided by fit parents, fit and willing parents. Unfortunately, I have been to family law judge training sessions, and judges don't believe this. If you talk to family court judges, they believe it's their job to determine what the best interest of the child is. So what happens in practice is a judge decides how they would raise the child, and then they make you pay for it and execute it. And if you don't, they'll throw you in jail. And that's exactly what they did to me. I got a judge who had a gender expansive daughter and thought that I should raise my child a certain way, and she was willing to impose it with force of law on me.
So the way the judge,
Supreme Court letter.
So the Judge Mary, this judge had her own daughter was a gender expansive. So I'm assuming number of various pronouns and things like that.
Yeah.
So. And this was of course no call to potentially recuse yourself or anything like that.
I tried to get her recused. Her husband is a fact witness in my case, and she still wouldn't recuse. I actually went to a recusal hearing with a separate judge in Dallas County, and the judge said, "Well, I know that her husband is a fact witness. I've seen the video, but you can get the information some other way than through her husband, so she doesn't have to recuse." This is what goes on in family courts all across America. Yeah. The family court judges know, because you can't appeal their interlocutory decisions, that they have no oversight and they do whatever they want. And it's really tragic because we complain as conservatives about fatherlessness, about the breakdown of the family. And one thing we definitely know, the Republican Party itself should be very concerned with: married people vote Republican. Mm-hmm. Unmarried people don't. So we should be encouraging marriage and family staying together. All these problems are happening in family court. I can't get one single a conservative legal foundation to enter family court to help save my son. None of them go into family court, okay? All of the leftist foundations go into family court. They're making law in family court every single day. And our guys are not there. That's how we got gay marriage.
So
People don't know that.
why aren't they? Why aren't they in family court?
Well, they have some valid points. One, the family courts are the Wild West. They don't follow the law.
Yeah.
So appeals to the law don't really make any difference to a family court judge. I mean, look at my gag order. I mean,
Yeah.
it's just straight up unconstitutional. Any judge would find it, unenforceable. But they took my children from me based on it. So that's valid. The second reason is it's messy and emotional, and you might have to work with people accused of things that you don't want to be associated with. Like, for example, I was accused of domestic violence. I had an $80,000 criminal trial I had to pay for, because in the state of Texas, if you're convicted of domestic violence, you can never have primary custody of a child. For the rest of your life, you lose your right to possess a firearm. You can't hold any licensure. You can't get student loans in Texas if you've been convicted of domestic violence.
Yeah.
So it's a win button if you can get it. Fortunately, I had witnesses, but you get accused of all things in family court because the rules of evidence don't really apply. When you go into a criminal trial, there's strict rules to make sure everything's fair. Well, none of that applies in
family court. I'm trying to carry some stuff this year in Virginia. We'll see what happens with it, because you're right. Family court is a mess in part because I've tried to help constituents with it before, where they will get very frustrated with the process. And on one side, you're trying to protect kids. You're also trying to take into consideration the fact that, in an ideal situation, you want both, the mother and the father involved. And then, but then there's also an incentive structure within family court to accuse your spouse of everything possible.
Yes, there is.
In order to either gain custody or whatnot. And it is messy. And there is a lack of oversight. In fact, one of the things I'm looking at right now is a lack of oversight with respect to kind of the guardian ad litems and CPS.
Oh, they're amazing.
And how do we?
The abuses are amazing.
Yeah. How do we?
I've been through 8 CPS investigations.
Well, I think that's one of the interesting components of a lot of this too. When you talk, it is amazing to me when we were going through this process, and I was talking to a constituent, and the concern was, well, this is happening. And again, I don't know the situation. Like, do you have proof? I'm a legislator, right? I'm not an attorney. I'm not a guardian.
Sure.
I say, okay, have you talked to your guardian ad litem? Okay, are they doing this? Are they doing that? And then it was amazing how it would get to a particular point. I'm like, well, that's it. There's no other oversight. There's no other us. They've just decided. And you're like,
that's it.
Whoa, like, I get it. I get why there have to be certain allowances, especially in situations where abuse could potentially be taking place, and what do you do? But my God, I felt like a real problem with well, who do you appeal to? There is no one at this point.
There's no appeal.
Yeah.
It's an amazing fact.
Yeah. So there's obviously a huge issue there. So let me kind of bring it up to kind of this point. So you have essentially, here's the other part that I think people will struggle with on this, is that you had one court say, here are the conditions. And it sounds like that court was at least trying to be even-handed. All right, there's joint custody.
Yes.
Both of you are financially responsible for the well-being of your children. Here's some basic guidelines. But then here's what I don't understand. When the basic guidelines were set up in such a way to where now you are forced to essentially engage in the very activity you disagree with. The whole reason why you're in court is because you don't believe this is gender affirming. You believe this is dysphoria affirming, and that's damaging for your child. And yet the court required counseling you're supposed to go to is clearly taking a side in this issue. Now, here's my question. Why couldn't that specifically be appealed? Like that process?
Well, so most of the states have laws which remove appellate authority over interlocutory decisions in family court matters. You can go up on what's called a writ of mandamus. That's when you're actually asking a judge to order another judge to do something.
Yeah.
Which of course they're loath to do.
Yeah.
Right. Now I have actually won one mandamus. I'm famous here in Texas actually because nobody ever wins mandamus. I've actually won one because it was so egregious. It was just black letter law, and it was so egregious. But the whole point is really to give unlimited discretion to the family courts, and there's a reason for that. There's a federal law called Title 4D, It was passed in the late 1970s. This is the cause of the divorce explosion in the 1980s and the creation of, there were no family courts in the early 1980s. They didn't exist. They were created specifically because of Title 4D. Title 4D provides for matching funds for the collection of child support. So I don't know about Virginia, but I know about Texas. In Texas, it's $500 million. It's $480 to $520 million per year. The more child support that's issued, the more money the state gets in reimbursements. The more it collects, the more it gets in reimbursements. The entire Texas Attorney General's office is funded by the child support collection matching funds from Title 4D. Texas actually has a law in the Texas Government Code which requires all judges to rule in cases in such a way to maximize Title 4D reimbursements.
Wow.
Before anything is heard in case. This explains a lot of peculiar things in family court. Family court's known for giving custody to the dysfunctional parent, and they just do it consistently. They do it all the time. I watched a case ahead of mine one time, and they gave 2 children back to a heroin addict mother who had successfully passed the drug test after 15 days for the first time.
Oh my gosh.
Okay.
What was the alternative?
Why would they do that? That makes no sense, right? Everybody goes, nobody in their right mind would do things like, why do they do it? Here's why they do it. The state knows full well it will never collect child support from a heroin addict.
Oh.
And all that matching money, they don't get it.
Got it.
They know that the responsible parent will bankrupt themselves to protect their child and to take care of their child, and they'll get all the matching money for that. So the decision in family court doesn't come down to, are you a fit and willing parent? If that were the case, then in 99% of the cases, you would have both parents getting 50-50 custody because both parents are fit and willing, right? Most abuse is actually much rarer than we think, right?
Yeah.
So abuse and neglect, those are 2 ends of the spectrum, right? So what they do is they say, which person here will give me the maximum Title IV reimbursement for the state?
Wow.
And that's the person who loses custody so that they pay child support. That's the real calculation that's going on. You mentioned CPS, and if you're looking at laws around this, you need to know about Title 4E. Title 4E gives reimbursements for taking children. So when the state takes a child from a family, they get a Title 4E reimbursement just like Title 4D. Here's how it works in Texas. You'll get a satellite office in a rural county of Texas that's running low on budget. They'll look for a child to low IQ parents under 18 months of age, but they'll go as high as 2 with no medical problems. And they'll go and take their children. They usually do it through subterfuge. They do a well check and they bring along an extra party that they don't tell the parents are a psychologist. Mm-hmm. The psychologist, unbeknownst to them, is doing a psych eval and recommends taking the children. They take the children. Within 6 months, the child is adopted out, and that satellite office gets $250,000 in budget money. So there's financial incentives to take children. There's financial incentives to take fathers out of the home. So as a legislature, you have to ask yourself, how do you change the incentives in the bureaucracy? Well, I will submit to you that this is, if you look at the total money in all the states, this is as large as some of the largest defense programs.
Yeah.
And we've never successfully cut a large defense program. That's never happened in
I can
American
tell you
history.
right now, the political palatability. The only way this is going to be discussed, there will be no level-headed discussion like we're seeing taking place, right? It will be this idea that you just don't want women to be able to leave abusive situations, or you don't want children to be able to get the proper child support they need. Like, you just don't want that. You're the deadbeat dad supporter. And the problem is, this is always the problem with government trying to fulfill certain functions within society for which it was never truly designed to do. And it's these sort of second and third order effects that we don't get. Is that it sounds great. It really, I mean, think about this on a 50,000 foot level. It sounds great to say, well, of course, we're going to provide funding to, let's say, a smaller jurisdiction, a poorer jurisdiction that doesn't have the resources to be able to intervene and to be able to get a kid out of a dangerous situation, or ensure that children are financially supported by a parent that should be paying child support. It makes perfect sense if you're assuming that this is always going to be operated the way it was intended and only for the purposes that it was intended. Because what you've actually done, and we see this with other welfare programs, what you've actually done is incentivize the state to now engage in certain activities. And we've seen this with COVID spending. We've seen it with welfare spending. We've seen it with everything else. You're not just getting the reasonable use case scenario. You're creating a perverse incentive.
That's right.
Okay, so
if you ever want to know why young men are not marrying, I speak to young men all the time. I get invited to speak to masculinity conferences and so forth. This is what they tell me. They go to church and they get cajoled to get married. They're told that it's their duty, it's their God-given duty. The problem is they have actually witnessed their father's lives become totally destroyed. I talk to lots of young men. They're like, my father lived out of a car for 6 months.
Yeah.
Because the court look, I don't think, people understand the impact of child support. So in Texas, if you have 2 kids, they're going to take 30% of your gross pre-tax income. Okay. Most businesses could never survive confiscation of 30% of their pre-tax revenues.
Oh, yeah.
They would just go out of business.
Yeah.
I've done the numbers. If in Dallas County, based on cost of living, if you make less than $45,000 a year, you cannot rent a home. You're left with about $800 a month to live on. So it doesn't work. Second thing is you don't get to deduct that money as childcare expenses. Like that's one area where you could make it back up, as if you had a deduction or a credit. Actually, the mother that you pay gets to deduct it as childcare expenses, not you. Okay. Yeah. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is, for example, I've been for 11 years, I have had to submit all of my expenses. Like every credit card expense, every cash expense is scrutinized by an attorney, by an accountant, and by the judge in court, because they want to see if they can get more child support for me.
Yeah.
You permanently lose all financial privacy. I have been told by a judge, I had to file a motion to try to change jobs.
Wow.
Because it paid me $10,000 a year less, but made it more geographically convenient for me. The judge said, no, you cannot change jobs.
Wow.
So you lose all of your freedoms once you get into divorce court if you're designated as the one who pays the child support.
Yeah, no, and I've seen this before too, where it's like the positive use case scenario of this is you have somebody that kind of manipulates the system or leaves a job temporarily in order to get a lower rate requirement for child support, and then immediately gets a higher job or whatever it is, right? Like there's the system can be gamed either way, but you're
Definitely.
right. It creates this perverse incentive. Well, and I'll tell you this, I'm a huge marriage advocate, right? I am a ton of my content is about the importance of marriage, the necessity of marriage in society. Yeah. But you're not wrong that here's I'll put it to you the most crass way it was put to me. Nick, please explain to me why I should risk getting married so the government will pay a woman to leave me, take my kids, and I can spend the rest of my life to pay my ex-wife to sleep with another dude.
That's exactly right. And that's exactly what young men tell me.
Yeah.
So and remember, married people vote Republican. Yeah. So when young men decide not to get married, you're increasing the number of Democrat voters out there.
Well, and look, there's a whole range on that. It's also the numbers for divorcees are really significant.
Yes.
Divorced men actually vote in orders of magnitude more to the left than married men do, and it's again and look, we could do a whole episode because I'm a firm believer that if you look a lot of the ideology behind this, there is a major movement within this country that despises the concept of the nuclear family. They think it's patriarchal. They think it's oppressive, and anything they can do to undermine it or break it up. They don't think they're doing nefarious work. They think they're doing, they're doing a wonderful service, but it's horrible. Well, let me ask you this at this point. So, because this is the part that I don't think people fully appreciate. Again, the way I started this whole thing off was, if this whole case originated in California, everyone would be like, well, yeah, you're living in California. It's official clown world. This was Texas, right? Yes. Texas is the place where I think most people think they could actually go to be safe from this sort of nonsense. And yet it was again, Republican judges with I imagine a fair amount of people within the Republican legislature that were giving you issues on this. So here's what I'd like you to the extent that from your perspective,
Mm-hmm.
Why do you think even, and the simple answer is usually, well, they're rhinos. Okay,
no,
but
I'm going to give you a much worse answer than
okay,
that. And
good.
It's an answer that's backed up by evidence.
Okay, good. Why is it that you would think in a state with a conservative culture, in a state that presumably, believes in the nuclear family and has a legislature, a governor, an attorney general, and presumably elected judges, maybe outside of like Austin or Dallas or Houston, right? That would reinforce. Why is this happening there?
All right. So let me give you level set you on just how conservative the electorate is in Texas. One of the ways I got this law passed that outlawed these barbaric transgender procedures on kids in Texas is I mobilized the rural counties where, 600 votes can swing an election for a senator, right? So you can exert some pressure on somebody if you can take 600 votes. So I had enough money to go into these rural counties out in West Texas, and I went out there. There were a couple of occasions where sheriffs had to show up and say, guys, put your guns away. This is not how we need to settle. Like, that's how conservative Texas is.
Yeah.
They will hang people from trees for this kind of stuff. So
for hurting a kid.
Yeah, for hurting a kid.
Yeah.
So if you're an elected official, think you're in the Texas legislature. Let's say you're in the House. How do you square this problem? You have an extremely conservative, I would even say right-wing electorate. And yet you have a voting base, a donor base in the Republican Party that's a Northeastern liberal that gives you all the money. And lest you question whether they're liberals, there's a guy named Paul Singer. He's the largest donor to the Republican Party.
Yep.
He founded the transgender movement in the United States. He founded the Human Rights Campaign, the Yellow Equal Sign. He founded that organization. He still funds it. And he's the guy that started the transgender movement. It was a Republican who started the transgender movement, not Democrats. And it was a Republican donor. Okay. It's James Pritzker, who used to be the third largest donor to the Republican Party. He's now an ugly man in a dress named Jennifer. He started the child transgender movement. He was a Republican at the time. So what you have in America is you have one big donor class, and they're all Northeastern liberals. Most of them these days are hedge fund billionaires. Mm-hmm. So they're all Yankee. We call them Yankees. No offense to you. we call them Yankees. And these Yankee liberals give all the money to the Republican Party. So let's put yourself back in. You're that legislator in the Texas House. You got a conservative electorate, but you're getting all your money from the donors, and those donors control key positions in Texas that could knock you out of office anytime they want. So how do you fix that problem? Here's what you do. You pass a bill like the transgender bill that I wrote. You pass it, but you remove those 3 sentences classifying it as felony child sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. You put a loophole in it. So now you can't do the procedure in Texas, but you can fly your kid to Colorado and cut his balls off and fly him right back to Texas. Okay.
Yeah.
So now this legislature can go to his constituents and say, see how conservative I am? I outlawed transgender procedures. Then he can go to the donors and he can say, you see, man, you can still give me money. I left those loopholes for you.
Got it.
That's the game that's been played on Republicans from time immemorial.
Well, let me ask you this: how do we? So with Paul Singer, because I've obviously heard of Paul Singer. To listen, you don't need to convince me that a lot of the wealthy donor class doesn't want to touch any social issues, which I think are so much more than social issues, right? These are like basic, fundamentally moral issues about humanity. But that's how they categorize them. So they don't want to touch abortion. They don't want to touch transgender. They don't want to touch, anything with LGBTQ. They don't want to touch any of it. And increasingly you used to be able to make the argument, well, they at least understand that communist economic policy is really bad, right? Mm-hmm. And they wanted to maintain some level of property rights, free market economics and things like that. And so whenever you're talking about taxes or regulatory policy, great. But by the same token, they'll be pushing stuff on the side. And so that I understand. But to say that, like, no kidding, Paul Singer started this movement, because like I'm very familiar with people like John Money and the work they did on the academic side and the research side and the work that Kinsey did that provided this kind of pseudo-intellectual, pseudo-scientific justification for a lot of what's going on and for what fueled a lot of this. But how do you go so far as to say that no, Paul Singer bears not just significant responsibility, but primary responsibility for this movement? Like, how do you go that far?
So he's the founder of the Human Rights Campaign. If you look that up on the internet, you'll see that it's the most influential LGBT lobbying group in the world. It's the reason we put pride flags on all of our embassies all over the world, right under the American flag. The Human Rights Campaign worked together with BlackRock to create a gay, lesbian, and transgender index score for corporations.
Okay.
And it caused HR departments to completely change the way they do hiring and to give preference for transgender people. In addition, because we have elected judges, Paul Singer makes it a point to make sure that judges that agree with his point of view on gay and LGBT issues are elected. And sure enough, what did we see when the Title VII case came up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where the question was this: there's a 1965 law which bans discrimination on the basis of sex in the workplace.
Yeah.
We had a defection. Justice Kavanaugh defected to the liberal side and decided that the word sex included crossdressers and trans people. And so now it's illegal not to hire trans people. And that's been imposed on us by the court. And that's because of the donor class. There's just no other explanation for it, because there's no basis in law for this, and everybody knows it.
Yeah, well, and you see, I'm looking here too. I mean, Singer's son is gay and got married in 2009 in Massachusetts. Yeah. So there's a personal component to this for him.
And let's not forget, Singer funds the Manhattan Institute.
Yeah.
The Heritage Foundation. He's a big contributor to Cato. He influences what these think tanks come out with and what they recommend, and that in turn influences legislators. And the other thing is, federal legislators are extremely unwilling to cross Paul Singer. He's one of the most litigious men in America.
Yeah.
So, you don't want to cross Paul Singer if you're an elected official. But he's I cite him not as like the evil genius or something like that. He's just one of the most prominent member of a group of oligarchs on Wall Street that have been pushing this agenda. BlackRock is another, by the way.
Oh, well, but yeah, BlackRock's got over $9 trillion in assets, and they are completely bought in. It is amazing to me that it is amazing to me I don't understand how elements within the conservative movement, and look, I consider myself, I'm a very liberty-focused Republican. Mm-hmm. I want a very, very small government, and I typically don't like the government imposing things or regulating things, even things that I don't necessarily personally like. Mm-hmm. But it's amazing how you have this wing within the Republican Party, and again, it is largely the donor wing. Now, I do think certain organizations, I think Heritage has done a pretty good job of staying true to kind of their overall belief set, but there's definitely been others that have pushed it differently. But it's amazing how they don't seem to make any connection between kind of the core economic principles and maybe principles of free speech or voluntary association or freedom of association. They don't seem to make any connection between that and some of the things that largely get grouped into social issues. And I don't know. It's just fascinating to me, but it's
look. Fundamentally, what you're describing is what I call classical liberalism.
Yeah,
right. It's an individualist philosophy, and I would just claim that leftism is of the Paul Singer variety. I mean, Paul Singer is a leftist Republican. Mm-hmm. I mean, on fiscal issues, maybe he's for sound fiscal issues, but everywhere else, he's just a straight up leftist. And he has probably the most financial influence in the Republican Party of anybody. Mm-hmm. Maybe Adelson is equal to him.
Yeah, he's
Adelson is also pro-LGBT, by the way.
Yeah.
So the issue is, if you adopt an individualist ethic, a classical liberal individualist ethic, how do you stop it from descending into the expressive individualism that the left has? Where's the stopping point?
You can't unless it's connected to like a coherent religious belief or moral belief. I mean, this is why John Adams said our Constitution was written for a religious and moral people. Exactly. It's totally unsuited to any other. And this is the what we sometimes refer to on our show as the atomized individualism. This idea that no, what made American individualism work is that it was a sense of rugged individualism combined with a strong sense of family and community.
Yes.
Now, if you eliminate the moral foundation for why is family good, and let's face it, Karl Marx was very, very open about his disdain for what we would call the traditional or nuclear family. And that carried over into your French existentialists. It carried over into like Herbert Marcuse and the Frankfurt School. Like all of these
you mentioned
things,
the Frankfurt School.
yeah, all of these things. Whenever you mention it, people have this tendency to be like, "Oh, Kevin McCarthy, Red Scare." I'm not saying that everybody is a dedicated Marxist that wants the full manifestation of communism.
Right.
What I'm saying is that they bought into Marx's explanation of what ills the world, and they have different variations of solutions to it. But one of the unifying factors among those solutions tends to be the denigration, or like on the more extreme side, it's the elimination of what we would call the nuclear family and the collective raising of children and education of children. And on the more nuanced version, it's this idea of expanding the definitions of these things to essentially remove any real distinction. And
that's right.
And all of that will undermine, because those things are actually quite critical to the other things that you like about classical liberalism: the freedom of inquiry, the freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, the free market economics, the property rights. Because those things are necessary components to appreciate these other things. If you get rid of one, you get rid of the other. And I don't think certain people have realized that yet. But look, I don't want to get too far afield on kind of the, even though I enjoy the conversation about the underlying
super interesting
philosophy.
though.
Yeah, and I do think it's ultimately relevant. Here's what I would ask is, because it is stuff like this, and Jonathan Haidt has had some interesting ideas about what kind of motivates different groups based off of how they philosophically align. I don't want to just say politically align, but philosophically align. And one of the core components, one of the key motivators, especially for what we would call more of the conservative side, is disgust. And as we're talking about this, and as we're talking about what is happening to children, and specifically your child, or what could be happening to them, there is a healthy amount of disgust here that I don't think the left fully appreciates. But here's what I want to know. What do you think is absolutely key? I think most of us appreciate that California has reached a tipping point to where they're probably going to have to take a really solid nosedive for people to fully appreciate that, yes, this is why California is going in the direction it is, and this is what is to blame. Because the other thing, too, that has been, I mean, look, if you appreciate nothing else about the left, their ability to help people misdiagnose problems is incredible.
Oh, amazing.
Absolutely incredible. But we expect more out of Texas. And if anything, I not only want you to obviously be successful in the legal battles that you're facing, but I want people to wake up to the idea that they cannot be guaranteed that simply because they think they have a conservative culture or legislature or judicial system, that something like this can't happen to them. So what needs to happen legislatively, maybe socially, in your opinion, for people to truly understand what needs to be done in order to make sure that their child can be protected from something like this?
Well, I ran for office in House District 63 right here in Texas.
Yeah.
And one of the reasons they put that gag order on me was to prevent me from talking about the very issues you're asking me about during my election. And my platform was very simple. It was about creating a contiguous landmass of states which would push back on the left in this country and push back on federal government overreach. And it has to be contiguous. And the idea was to do a couple of things. One, if they can pass transgender sanctuary bills to protect kids to get so-called gender-affirming care, why can't we pass transgender sanctuary bills where we won't return children to places that do these barbaric things to children?
Yeah.
Why don't we do that? And our Republicans won't do it. They won't do it because the donors don't want them to do it.
Do you think none of them will do it, or do you think that it's just...
I've been thrown out of the Texas House for suggesting it.
So here's what that's a good point. And this is, we've mentioned this a lot on our show too, that if you're electing people simply because they have an R by their name, you don't understand what has gone on within the Republican Party. By the same token, I've seen people that are all too willing to champion these causes, but they do it horribly, or and again, I think some people get targeted for destruction. I think other people just haven't been properly vetted, and they say things or they advocate for things that we really want to hear from people, and we immediately elevate them to positions of power and influence, only to find out, oh crap, they did this or they did that. But there is a need. There isn't, like, this whole conversation that we've had right here, right? This is all seemed to be an incredibly, I think, level-headed. You're not throwing things. You're not you're not spitting at the screen, and you're actually undergoing quite a lot right now. And I feel like you have laid out an incredibly calm, cool, collective, and intellectually rigorous argument for what you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I do think, one of the things that I hope comes from this is not only, potentially help for you on your legal battle, but I also hope that it wakes people up to the point that voters have to start asking better questions of the people that want to represent them.
Yes.
And those questions cannot just be, do you support, parental rights? There needs to be more specific questions asked. Will you support legislation that does X, Y, and Z? Will you carry it? When will you carry it? That's the sort of thing we need to see. And we need people within, and again, I'm a state elected official. I've been more than happy to carry controversial bills and present them in a way that I believe is, again, intellectually rigorous, calm, cool, and collected. But let's have the argument. And I think I will also say this. I think it's about time for conservative legislators to also understand that part of the reason why you're having to carry what would have been seen as an absurd piece of legislation 10 years ago, saying, hey, you're not allowed to cut off the perfectly healthy genitalia of children. You're not allowed to do that, right? That would have seemed like, well, of course you can't do that. What is this?
Most morally obvious question since slavery.
Right. Where is this coming from? And yet here we are. And the reason why that has transpired is because we tax to the tune of billions of dollars every year from people, and then we give it to educational institutions, or we give it to these 501c3 nonprofits who are supposed to be non-ideological, who then develop curriculums, who then be the ones informing your end up becoming required lessons for your teachers. And what happens? Well, in the space of a decade, we now have a significant portion of the electorate saying, well, yes, of course, it's the only compassionate thing to do is to give chemical castration medicine to a 12-year-old. What?
Yes.
So if you are wondering why we're in this position, it's because you sat there and mindlessly handed over in Virginia $3.8 billion a year to higher ed that decided to push this stuff. And now you have HR departments, you have legal departments, you have everyone else that is fully bought onto, well, of course, this is the way that we're supposed to view this topic.
Yes.
And it is about time for legislators to start getting more strategic and for voters on the other side of this, right? For voters to become a little bit more aware that when you see the ad of like, well, delegate so-and-so or state senator so-and-so wants to cut funding for education, when in reality, what they want to do is cut maybe $10 million for this program that is not educating anyone except on creating activists for hardcore progressive institutions.
That's right. One of the biggest problems we face is our guys are very vulnerable to enemy propaganda. And the reason is because of the very things that Haidt lays out.
Yeah.
One of the things that people with a conservative temperament really is really important to them is social order. And they're willing to compromise on a lot of things to maintain that social order, because we know the consequences of the loss of social order, and it's not good.
Yeah.
The left doesn't have that kind of consciousness. They're willing to suffer social disorder to get what they want. And so there's a kind of conventional thinking that develops where people fill in with their conservative common sense what they think is really happening. So they hear, oh, he's going to cut $10 million from Tarrant County College. That's one of the liberal colleges near where I live.
Yeah.
They're going to cut $10 million from it. He's trying to cut education. But they don't ever go through like, well, how has that education worked out for us?
Yeah.
Like, who inhabits public schools? In most of these small counties, public schools are the largest employers. They have the largest budget money.
Oh,
they have the largest impact on the county economy, and they exert tremendous political control through that on the counties, and they're all leftists.
You will watch. I'm in like an R+22 district, so that's a good district, right? That's a solid
nice.
district. I'm not even close to being the most conservative district in the Commonwealth of Virginia.
Wow.
And yet, go to some of the most hardcore conservative districts. That does not mean you are getting that sort of representation in Richmond. And it's for exactly the reason you just said. If the school district is the largest employer, if maybe the hospital is the largest employer,
yes.
Oh, you will see just how quickly you can convince an otherwise, the same conservative that will be, oh, hell, from my cold dead hands when it comes to the Second Amendment, will then vote for some of the most ridiculous spending bills. And you're sitting there, why is that? Well, because they're not going to cross the largest employer in their district.
That's right. That's right.
And
that's the game that gets played.
Yes, constantly. No, you're
and our guys
right.
are, unfortunately, our guys are just very vulnerable. Another thing that our guys, and this was used against me in my election, it's used against conservative candidates in the primaries in Texas.
Yeah.
The liberal Republican establishment here will knock out conservatives in the primaries using this technique. You'll get a conservative running against a rhino, or an establishment guy, even worse. And they'll split the Republican vote on some kind of moral issue they find with the conservative.
Yeah.
Right. And the reason usually conservative guys run is because they've been pushed around by government.
Yep.
They're victims of government. And that's what I always say. If you're looking for a good candidate, find a victim of government, because when it's personal, they ain't backing down.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
You should look for people who've been personally harmed by government if you want limited government. So they find, and then they split the vote. We have open primaries here, and they'll bring in Democrat voters to vote for the establishment guy to make up the difference.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And the reason you can split off Republican votes on moral issues is because our people have become very vulnerable to this kind of propaganda from the left, where they gin up fake moral issues, just like they did with Trump, right? Just like they did with General Flynn. They do with all these people. And our guys are very vulnerable to it. I think one of the things that we need to long-term think about is, how do we counter propagandize among our own people to get and make them more resistant over time to this kind of stuff, so that we can really elect some fighters. And because, a fighter, he's got bloody knuckles, he's got scars, that's because he's been in fights. And if you've been in fights, you're going to lose a few.
Oh yeah.
And, so those guys don't look like the guys in cardigan sweaters that, show up at all the social events and have a martini glass in their hand. Fighters don't look like that. They don't talk like that. But those are the guys we need.
Well,
I think
they get tired.
Something we need to think about.
They get tired the fastest. They get tired.
Yes,
the fastest.
they do. Yes,
because
they do.
if you are in government because you are trying to restrict its growth, restrict its authority, restrict its influence, everybody kind of hates you, right? Within that establishment, even people that might, principally agree with you on certain things. You're not the one trying to bring home the bacon. You're the one trying to keep the bacon from leaving your constituents' pockets, right?
Right.
You're not the one that I don't enjoy going to a bunch of there. It is amazing how, and again, I think you're right. I think there's a lot of voter education that's necessary on this, where you're going to have to, there's going to be times where I understand why people want to see their representatives. And I understand, and you should have a representative that is present and that is very good at addressing constituent concerns and whatnot. But the other thing that you're going to have to realize, especially in state legislatures, where this is not I know in Texas they meet once every 2 years. Yes. In Virginia, it's 60 days and even years, 45 and odd. We get paid. If you're a delegate, you paid $17,600 a year. It's not meant to be a full-time job, which I love.
Right.
But what that also means is they can't show up to every single chicken dinner. They can't show up to every single social engagement. And chances are, if you have somebody that is very, very adamant about fighting back against the government, they're the least comfortable at what amounts to usually a lot of little government socials.
Right.
A lot of various things. They want to go there. They want to fight against government. They want to work on their business. They want to spend time with their family. They want to go to church. And yeah, they want to go to community events, right? Just not every dang week. And
you're right.
And
let me just share an experience with you that I think really shows the difference between the Republicans and Democrats on this issue, and why I think we need to do some work. Right. Before I ran for office, I went down to Dallas County and pretended to be a convert from being a Republican to a Democrat. And I went to a Democrat meeting
Yeah.
just to see what it was like. And it shocked me because I showed up in a suit, first of all. Nobody else was in a suit.
Yeah.
So I showed up in the suit because what's a Republican event? It's a cocktail soiree followed by a charismatic speaker. You shake hands with a bunch of people and you go home.
Yeah.
That's what a Republican event is. So I go to this Democrat event, and it was kind of weird because it was on a Saturday and it was in the middle of the day, which I thought was weird.
Yeah.
Republicans don't do that. We do soirees at night.
Yeah.
So I show up in this suit, and they were all like, "Whoa, who is this guy?" And I said, "Oh, I'm a Republican, but I've really seen the light. I've changed my mind. And I went by my middle name."
Yeah.
And so they took my name down, and the lady said, "Well, what really interested you enough to change?" And I said, "What was the transgender issue?" And she said, "Oh, great." And she looked on this clip. She said, "Go to table 16.
What?
I was like, "What?" So I walk into this place, and it's a big open hall. I find table 16. There's these two blue-haired lesbians there.
Yeah.
And they start explaining to me, like, "Okay, let me see where your precinct is in Flower Mound. Okay, I see where you are. That's a Republican precinct. Here is our playbook for converting Republican precincts. Here it is. It's a 16-page white paper. If you will sign up to this today and give us $25 for the book version of this, which is 200 pages, which has all the forms and gives you everything you need to know, we will give you a free website for your precinct, just a static website. And then if you can get 25 people in attendance for 4 straight months at your precinct meetings, we'll put a donation button on your website, and you can keep 15% of that for your precinct."
Wow.
And they just start laying out a game plan for how to subvert my entire precinct.
Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
They had, how do you talk to Christians about the transgender issue?
Yeah.
How do you talk to constitutionalists about the transgender issue? Like the constitutionalist one, I remember particularly, it was, well, you don't want the government interfering in family decisions.
Yep.
We don't want to do that. Like they had a whole playbook for me.
Yeah.
I left there like I was going to lead a precinct for the Democratic Party, and they were going to back me up with everything.
Yeah.
I had phone numbers of people to call. They had my email address, my fake email address.
Yeah.
That's what Democrat events look like. Democrats are not trying to raise awareness.
Yeah.
They're organizing to defeat Republicans. Republicans just raise awareness.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it's
huge difference.
I
scared the crap out of me.
Oh yeah, no, it should. I remember when I first joined a local committee, and I was like, "So what's the precinct coordination plan?" Like, "Oh well, on election day we'll have some people that volunteer to go out front." I'm like, "Well, no, what's the plan to like knock doors ahead of time? What's the plan to do this?
Right.
What's the plan to hand out literature? What are our talking points?" Well, that'll come down. We kind of let the campaigns do that. I'm like, "Oh my gosh, this is like you said, this is a social club. This is not a serious entity."
It's not.
And then the other part about it and then the other 50% of the time was like, how much internal fighting can we have over stuff that we have very little control over? And it was just amazing. And we were able to significantly change some stuff and make it a lot more, forward facing on what are the practical things that we can actually do to affect, change. What can we, how do we compete in these local elections? What are the things that we do? So it can be done. Right.
Definitely.
And it was amazing. I talked to one group, and I said, "Look, one of the things that we have to understand too is that we're never going to be collectivists, and so we're never going to operate like collectivists. But that doesn't mean that our own philosophy doesn't provide some electoral advantages if we actually lean into them." So I think you're right. But well, listen, I know we're coming up on the end here. Do me a favor: is there any place people can go to either learn more about your case or to provide support? What can be done on that front?
Yeah, so I don't take any money from anybody. I'm just big on this. Like, I'm my own man. I'm not beholden to anybody. I'm not looking for any money. But there are 3 things you can do. If you want to learn more about me, go to jeffyounger.substack.com.
Okay.
You can find me on X as well, and I post all kinds of controversial conservative content on X, and it's at Jeff Younger Show. I don't really have a show. I just call it Jeff Younger Show because I felt like with the publicity, my life had become like the Truman Show.
Yeah.
So it's a joke, actually. And the third thing you can do is start to advocate in your school districts and in your county for restricting these procedures on children and to stop schools from transitioning children behind the parents' backs.
I'm carrying Sage's law. I carried it last
Huge.
year. I'm carrying it this year. We're looking at some other legislation as well.
Great.
And yeah, no, I think we do need legislation. There's a lot of times where I will tell people that, hey, some of these things are family issues. Some of these things are
Right.
better solved at the either local level or the family level, because if you're giving the government the power to do one thing, they can always manipulate it. But this is one where there's no question. You're protecting a child's like physical person. Like this should not be difficult. All right. So at Jeff Younger Show on X. And then what was the other one? Jeff Younger.
jeffyounger.substack.com.
Okay, .substack.com. I want to be able to put
and
this.
I just published a letter to my sons. Since I can't send letters or birthday gifts and things to my sons, I publish open letters to my sons there in hopes that they can find me on the internet. And when they're adults and we can finally shake hands as men, they'll know that I never abandoned them, that I love them, and I'll always be their father.
Well, Jeff, I can't imagine how difficult it is to go through something like this. And I appreciate you being willing to talk about it. And look, to remind the audience, Jeff pays a price just for talking about it. Coming on the show and talking about it and making sure that you're aware of is stuff that the courts in Texas are threatening him with. I want you to imagine being in a situation where a judge seemingly makes a reasonable decision and says, okay, joint custody, because divorces are always messy. So joint custody between the mom and the dad, and but you got to go to this counseling. And then I want you to imagine that the counseling you're now forced to go to requires you to do the very thing that brought you into divorce court in the first place, requires you to undermine what you believe, what you very genuinely believe, and what the most of the world believed was the genuine health and mental well-being of the child. It requires you to completely undermine that in order to comply. And then what happens? Well, you being very reasonable and standing on a moral principle of saying, I don't think this is healthy for my child, I can't participate, says, well, now you're in violation of the order, which means we're going to have to reevaluate this. And all of a sudden you lose your kids. You find yourself in a situation where you're facing potential legal battles. They put a gag order on you that says you're not allowed to talk about any of this. Not allowed to talk about any of this. Just take the First Amendment and throw it right out the window. Why? Because an elected judge in Dallas has decided, well, that's the way we're going to do things. And then you have a Supreme Court that honestly puts in the opinion, well, of course, your wife can take your children and go to California where they know they have a completely different legal precedent, where they know they are fostering this sort of activity where now your children can be chemically castrated, and once they get a little bit older, surgically altered for life. And you're not even allowed to talk about it because the judge says so. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a certain point where you have to ask yourself, do you really live in a free country? And I don't mean that to be hyperbolic. I don't mean it to be hyperbolic. I still think the United States is an incredible country. And according to world standards, of course, we have a great deal of freedom that a lot of the rest of the world doesn't, a great deal of prosperity that the rest of the world doesn't. But if you honestly believe that can't be taken from you, well, then I would encourage you to go and look at what's happening to Jeff right now. Because I will tell you right now, as a human being, as a person, there is a whole lot we all put up with that we don't necessarily like for the benefit of living within civil society. But there are lines that should never be crossed. And when it comes to our children, that's always been a sacred line. And yet we find it being crossed in places like Texas because voters, many of them, conservative voters, do not understand what is at stake right now and will not get involved to the level necessary to just simply ask questions of your legislator. I will promise you right now, I can say this as a sitting state legislature. If all of a sudden the phones are blowing up in the district going, why in the hell did you not vote for this? Or why in the hell did you vote for that? You know what? Guys like Paul Singer are powerful. There's no question. There's no question. But stop undermining your own power. It doesn't require a great deal, but I will tell you this. I want those legislators who maybe feel obliged because of donors or maybe feel obliged or even concerned that they'll lose their seat. I want them to at least be equally concerned that they can lose their seat because of you. And we've seen it happen. We saw it happen in Virginia. Ladies and gentlemen, Virginia is not a red state. We're barely a purple one anymore. And what did we see when Democrats tried to come in on a Second Amendment issue? We saw 100 out of over 120 jurisdictions in Virginia. We saw 100 come in and say, we're going to be sanctuary counties. You can't do this. We saw 30,000 people show up to the Capitol, and we saw the other side kill their own bill because they realized what an amazing electoral backlash they were about to experience. We saw 5,000 people showing up to boards of supervisors meetings that usually can't get 30 in there. It can be done. All you have to do is think strategically on some of this. It doesn't require you to drop your job and to join 14 different committees and to donate thousands of dollars. A lot of times what it requires is when you have a very short legislative session, which Texas does once every 2 years, Virginia 60 days in even years, 45 days in odd. All it requires is a certain degree of consistent attention over that period to where people know that you are watching and you have expectations. And what will end up happening is that same elected official will go back to those big donors and say, look, I can't do it. I got to vote this way. Well, we'll cut off. Well, sorry, I don't know what to tell you. I'm going to lose either way. And they'll even tell them, well, look, do you want me or do you want the guy that's going to replace me? And they'll back off that issue. Now, that might not be the perfect example. You might want to replace the weak representative you have with a strong one. But if that weak representative at least understands, hey, there's a bigger price to be paid by crossing my constituents on something so fundamental. Okay, fine. Look, if you have a strong representative, support them. If you have a weak one that you can't replace, well, if they respond to that sort of incentive structure, then you be the incentive structure. That's how you're going to get the things that you actually want out of your legislature. And the other thing I will end with on this, because I want you to go to @JeffYounger show on X. I want you to go to jeffyounger.substack.com. I want you to check all of that out. But I also want you to understand that so much of this is taking place within your kids' educational institutions, right? And it doesn't mean that all the teachers are pushing it or the principal. It doesn't mean that. But you would be shocked. You would be absolutely shocked to see how much of this is being pushed, even in your rural schools, even in schools within conservative districts. It really is mind-boggling. Do some basic FOIA searches. Understand that this stuff is in their school libraries. Understand that higher ed is pushing this on a level you cannot possibly imagine. Understand that anybody that wants to teach in your nice conservative local rural school has to go to the same university's education departments, which are pushing this sort of ideology. And you're thinking that can't be happening. Ladies and gentlemen, how much proof do you need? How much proof do you need? Or will it have to actually show up on your door before you are willing to put in minimal effort to make it happen? So, Jeff, thank you very much for being here, sharing your story. Thank you very much for fighting the good fight. And again, sitting here and having a conversation, listening to someone come back and add, well, what about this? What about that? And being able to say, no, here it is. I really appreciate that. Thank you very much. And
thank you. It's a pleasure.
And thank you to everyone for joining. Again, go check those out. We'll put them in the show notes page as well. And thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next episode.